Our next piece of advice is to not stop at being question ready, but also to be response ready. In 1 Peter 3 verse 15, we are exhorted to always set apart Christ in our hearts as Lord. And how does Peter instruct us to do this? By always being prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Don't you just love Peter's assumption here that we are living our lives with such extraordinary and uncommon hope that it can cause people to ask questions about what possible reason we might have that can account for it? That too is a fundamental part of what it means to be response ready, to ourselves be responding daily to the good news of the gospel in such a surrendered and visible way that people are drawn to the glory of Christ shining through our broken vessels in the first place. And yet, sometimes, when it comes to sharing our faith, we can feel hesitant to even start a conversation, let alone to allow our hope to shine out, because we're terrified that we won't know how to respond if someone asks us a difficult question. Particularly in a culture that is trending towards hostility to the Christian faith, no longer viewing Christian beliefs as, naive but harmless, but rather as harmful or at times even hateful. And yet the truth of the matter is that we are rarely asked a question that blindsides us. We already know the questions of our culture, and we actually know them really well. And to prove that point, if I asked you to list the top 10 questions that you never want a non-believer to ask you, I bet you could reel them off in quick succession right now. It's not that we don't know what the questions are. It's just that we sometimes haven't prioritized them carefully and prayerfully thinking through the answers because we find them difficult. The reality is that we do know the questions. It's just a case of whether we're willing to do the hard work of preparing for them. But guys, this is about so much more than whether we risk suffering through social awkwardness or a hit to our popularity. This is a matter of life and death. So let's treat the questions of our culture and our friends with the seriousness that they deserve. And also be encouraged that while every so often we might get asked a more challenging question, usually being response ready simply means being prepared for the basic questions that you get asked every single day. If I know I'm going to see somebody today, why shouldn't I take some time to pray about them and to ask God for a good answer to a question I think they're likely to ask me? I don't see anything artificial or disingenuous about that. It just means that I care enough about the person to give them a real answer rather than the first thing that just happens to jump into my head on the spot. I wouldn't do that with teaching. What if I just showed up today to record this video and just started rambling about the first thing that came into my mind? And in case you're wondering, and it's hard to tell, no, that's not actually what I did. But likewise, I would never just wing an important presentation for a course I was taking or for a critical work project. So why then do we almost always just wing conversation? I used to think it was remarkable how quick Jesus was on his feet in response to questions, and of course I still do. But to a certain extent, I used to find it discouraging because he's always coming out with these amazing lines like, "Why do you call me good?" Or "You who are without sin, throw the first stone," or "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's." The sort of lines that I think of hours later when I'm drifting off to sleep and it's already far too late. I'm still just as amazed at Jesus' conversational gifts, but the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether these are just instances of Jesus being incredibly quick on his feet, or whether they're also cases of him having prayed and thought hard about how to respond to common questions or to questions and challenges that he saw coming. The British abolitionist William Wilberforce, who played a key role in bringing an end to the British international slave trade in the early 19th century, was also an excellent personal evangelist. And one of the reasons for this was because every evening after dinner, he'd spend an hour looking over his calendar for the next day at who he was going to be spending time with. And then he developed what he called launches, responses to questions or topics of conversation that he knew would lead to meaningful spiritual conversations. You can actually read them in his diaries. You know what? Maybe Jesus spent an hour after dinner or early in the morning thinking hard about the people that the Father had placed in his life and the conversations that he would like to have with them, thinking of good questions to ask and good answers to give to questions that he could be expecting. And perhaps it's some of those launches that we find recorded in the New Testament. What about us? What are the questions we get asked most often? We know what they are. How was your weekend? Not bad, thanks. Or how was your weekend? You're really good, actually. Saturday, we just did some stuff around the house, but then Sunday, we went to church, which is always a highlight for us. Do you ever go to church? No, I never used to go either, but a friend invited me along a few years ago and I found it incredibly meaningful and honestly an amazing opportunity to be part of this community. I've never felt so known and loved. It would be great to have you come along sometime. That's just an honest answer. There's nothing weird about saying that at all. In fact, if you've encountered the living God in church on Sunday, then just saying, fine, thanks, it's not even an honest answer, is it? If you're a church-going Christian and you're excited about sharing God with others, then that question, how was your weekend, is an absolute gift. Think about it. How was your weekend is the kind of question that you're probably going to get asked on average 5 times a week. 52 weeks a year makes that roughly around 250 times a year. Multiply that by 50, and that makes for around 12,500 times that you might be asked that question in your adult life. What if instead of just shrugging it off when the question comes, or just kind of spitting out the first thing that happens to pop into our heads, we took just half an hour to come up with some really meaningful, life-giving responses to that question, which would open the door to a faith conversation. Can you imagine over the course of a lifetime what a difference that could make? How many spiritual conversations might flow out of that? How many relationships might deepen? How many people might come to church because you invited them off the back of that conversation? And how many lives could be transformed? There are many different ways to answer questions like, how was your weekend? And what do you do? Some answers will lead to meaningful conversations and others are unlikely to. But everyday questions are an amazing opportunity that we pass up all the time. So I want to invite you either right now or perhaps as part of your prayer time with God this week or in the coming weeks, or even to do this with a friend, to identify common questions that we tend to respond to uncreatively. Questions like, how was your weekend? What do you do? How are you doing? Where are you from? And then to spend time thinking through and writing down how you might respond more intentionally and honestly to those questions in a way that can lead to spiritually rich conversations.